The ideological method looks to analyze and inquire about a society's core beliefs and values scientifically. It is important to analyze ideologies because they lead to both beliefs and behaviors. Ideologies are culturally bound, taken for granted that citizens often believe to be normal. McGee says that ideologies both prohibit and protect us. Ideologies allow citizens to communicate with each other, build a shared understanding, and a history of that moment in time. Important questions to examine ideologies with are, who benefits from this belief? Other theoretical questions to consider from the rhetorical sourcebook are, what are the effects and implications of discursively produced ideological systems, and how do these discourse and symbols produce these effects? We have two traditions within the ideology sphere. The first tradition is a Marx tradition. The Marx tradition sees ideology as linked to a mental infection that distorts a person's ability to think and perceive the world around them. In this sense, ideologies contribute to the mystification of power and domination. This creates a false consciousness for citizens, where ideology is an object and something that needs to be critiqued and needs to be overcome for the classes to truly be free. The second tradition is ideology as a belief system. Beliefs typically cluster together to form systems whose characteristics can be studied. A belief system is something like liberal capitalism. Ideology is something that needs to be studied in that sense, but can also be critiqued and overcome. McCarrow says that ideology is a rhetorical construct that has no existence apart from its expression as a symbol system. The discursive and symbolic practices that sustain ideological systems produce effects that must not only be understood, but in many cases must be opposed and fought against as well. Example of this is the ideology of racism, which I'll touch on in my artifact. Giddens defines ideology as a structure of signification that legitimizes the sexual interests of hegemonic groups in ways that conceal their social domination. Giddens gives us 3 steps to identify and acknowledge those hegemonic ideologies. So the first is ideological structures that depict sectional interests as universal ones, concealing a particular interest at stake. The second is that ideological structures deny or transmute contradictions. And the third one is ideological structures naturalize and reify the existing status quo, sustaining the interests of a dominant group. So ideographs, just like ideology, are historically and culturally grounded, and they can serve as a commonplace that sum up and evoke identification with key social movements. When we think of ideographs, we can think of terms like liberty, rule of law, equality, these ideographs that serve and communicate their interests at large. An ideograph should always be considered in relation to others. It is defined by using other terms in its clusters, and we'll see two examples of that in both the Cloud and the Haddon articles. The first external article that I analyzed was To Veil the Threat of Terror, Afghan Women and the Class of Civilization and the Imagery of the U.S. War on Terror, and that was written by Dana L. Cloud. So the ideograph in this article was the Clash of Civilizations, and that served as both a verbal and visual ideograph linked to the white man's burden within the war in Afghanistan. So within this class of civilization, the ideas of the U.S. and its people were seen as incontrollably in conflict with others. In this sense, others is defined particularly as an Islamic other and inferior and hostile to Western ideals and Western capitalism. So these images of Afghan women are used to encourage the American viewer to be a paternalistic viewer, and that creates the desire and the need and want to pull Afghanistan into this modern day world. And so we see this contradiction between light and darkness. The pictures of Afghan women are shown in black and white, or shown in the desert, or shown without modern amenities for the U.S. voter or U.S. viewer to say, I want to help these women, and the way that I can help these women is by supporting the war in Afghanistan. Our involvement in Afghanistan is seen as something that's patriotic in that sense. Mass support of the war is reproduced in part by the photographs that are shown and reproduced in mass media. These photographs encourage viewers to interpret the war as a moral clash of good and evil, between reasonable people and the irrational other. These photos establish a fundamental difference between the heroic white, rational U.S. soldier and the scruffy Al-Qaeda fighters, which are represented as militants that are just savages in the desert. The U.S. soldier stands in as a representation of country and of our economic system. So the United States and capitalism is seen as the ultimate symbol of democracy. And in turn, Afghans are seen as anti-American and pre-capitalistic, which makes them barbaric and something that we need to go in and help save. Cloud says these images are about race. The white man is able to save these people, especially the women and children, which is an ideology and a narrative that American viewers support. Cloud concludes that the appeals made through these images and these images that serve as ideographs must not be understood as legitimate justification, but rather these ideographs should be understood as a pretext for war and occupation. Cloud says to counter this imperialistic, hegemonic ideal, there needs to be a movement that enables public reframing of the war in Afghanistan and enables the citizens to question such images that appear as slices of reality in a war that they do not see firsthand. These images represent all that American viewers will see of Afghanistan unless they are in the armed forces, which many are not. So this reframing challenges these taken for granted images that perpetuate these nationalistic systems of ideals. So concluding, Cloud says that critical readings of images, these images that serve as ideographs, encourage oppositional interpretation and serve as an opportunity to impact the workings of these images that protect hegemonic systems. And these ideographs are used in accessible venues and languages, so we should encourage the reinterpretation of images that are found in our national news and on headlines that might be redirecting and framing paternalistic and imperialistic ideals of other countries. My second article is titled Revitalizing the Debate Between Life and Choice, the 2004 March for Women's Lives by Sarah Hayden. This article examines how ideographic meaning has the potential to be unfixed through imaged events. So the article begins with defining both of the ideographs, life and choice, and then working through to the example of the 2004 Women's March for Our Lives and how the ideograph of choice was changed through that event. So beginning with the ideograph of life, the article examines how abortion was long identified as murder and morally wrong by pro-life advocates. So the image that was used was of a fetus that was often labeled as an unborn baby. So there was a connection between the fetus having the potential to grow into a child. It was a child that was not yet born. So the picture is magnified so that the fetus looks like a complete and separate individual. There's no imagery of the woman. It's specifically zoomed in on the uterus and the fetus that's within it. So the very presence, as I said, of the woman who carries the fetus is erased and not involved. And the image invites viewers to see the unjust ending of a complete and separate life. So the photos are trusted to capture what is there as an objective reality, so that if an abortion takes place, you are killing a separate other because there's not a connection of that fetus being connected to the woman. While the pro-choice ideograph was often considered stagnant, like the pro-life ideograph of the fetus, this changed in 2004 with the March for Women's Lives. The march participants revitalized and expanded the demands for choice, and they were able to challenge that fixed status as well as the claims for fetal life. So choice was placed in the context of a larger set of rights, and it was clustered with other ideographs. So the March for Women's Life was included with words like choice, justice, access, health, abortion, global, and family planning. So this new mission was to ensure that all women had the right to choose whether or not they had children with reproductive health options that were safe, affordable, and accessible. So through this event, the ideograph of choice was expanded greatly to mean safe reproductive health. So when marchers were able to expand that, they rearticulated and reinforced the elasticity inherent to ideographs. They were able to move away from that narrow and rigid articulation that the term had come to mean, pro-choice meaning just access to abortion, and they were able to expand that ideograph to include women's rights, women's health rights, and women's right to decide the direction of their lives. So this example Hayden used was to illustrate the ways that ideograph can be both stagnant and fluid through the intersection of images and discourse. So Hayden's argument is that this ideographic meaning has the potential to be unfixed through these imaged events, and that these ideographs can expand to meet the needs of the movement at that moment, which further reinforces the idea that these ideographs are historically and culturally bound, that through these historic events, these ideographic definitions change as the people involved in the movement decide and help change those ideographs. Similar to Cloud's article on Oprah and the ideology of the American dream, Tommy forwards an unquestioned faith in American opportunity and success. Tommy questions the very oppression that Kaepernick is protesting against because she believes no such injustice is possible in a country so great. The solution proposed by Tommy is for Kaepernick to simply leave the country if he's so upset about his oppression. Encouraging dissenters to leave works to further protect the status quo. If there is no one left protesting injustice, the system is forever protected. Isolating or exiling any threat to the system is the first step in that protection. Tommy says the First Amendment protects Kaepernick's right to be a whiny, indulgent, attention-seeking crybaby. This depiction paints Kaepernick's concerns as unlikely and counterproductive for the American attention span. Tommy directly states that Kaepernick should not blame white people for the problems that minority communities face. There is confusion here between the white person as an individual and the white hegemonic structure that exists in the United States and allows for the systematic white supremacy to exist. The anecdote that Kaepernick was adopted by white parents, so we should respect white people, reinforces that power hierarchy. The notion that people of color should feel lucky for the resources they have already received should not ask for more further entrenches that idea that white people are in control of these resources, and if people of color receive any, they should feel satisfied with that and not ask for any more. Kaepernick's advocacy is seen as asking for too much, and in turn makes him selfish. This reinforces that hierarchy. Tommy then asks, when will all these black communities take a step back and take some responsibility for the problems of black communities? Because it seems that blaming white people for all your problems might actually make you the racist. This narrative is similar to that of All Lives Matters, countering the reality that systematic racism exists and isolating white people from their responsibility and the historic disadvantaging of people of color. This ideology works to further invalidate the experiences of citizens who are not white. This rhetorical switch indicates that minority folks should actually blame themselves instead of a system that is historically rigged against them. This call further protects hegemonic systems, as those with racial privilege are disconnected from any blame because they are given a scapegoat for racism, the actual victims. This intense protection of the flag and anthem are deemed as the ultimate act of patriotism, which makes anyone not willing to glorify those American symbols unpatriotic, and in turn unwelcome here. This negotiation of patriotism distracts the conversation of racial injustice, further protecting the hegemonic system. In turn, we're having this conversation about patriotism instead of actually having a conversation about racial injustice, which is how the Black Lives Matter protest began and why Kaepernick was kneeling in the first place. Tommy's hierarchy of patriotism over further protesting is the example of this protection of the system. Tommy's concerns are seen as valid, while Kaepernick's are seen as attention-seeking. Black Lives Matter protesters have fought for public attention for their cause because white America did not believe racial injustice still existed without them fighting for that attention. To call Kaepernick's protesting attention seeking is accurate, but to call him a crybaby is demeaning. The agenda of public attention is decided by those who are in power, those who have the privilege of being pulled over without fear for their life, those protected by white hegemony. Ideological criticism allows for the reframing of Tommy's rant as an artifact that further validates the need for Kaepernick's protesting and an acknowledgement of the white supremacist system that encourages these views and protects such speech. This reframing acknowledges the systems of power that these ideologies perpetuate and the citizens who benefit from this exiling of protesters, including Kaepernick. Turning to Giddens, Tommy's speech allows the ideological structures to be ticketed as universal ones. These are sectional interests to protect the white America, to say that white America shouldn't be blamed for the experiences of people of color, even though those experiences are perpetuated by a hegemonic structure. So when Tommy says patriotism should be our number one concern and patriotism should be what Americans rally around, she's making that sectional interest a universal one and saying that Kaepernick is not a part of the universal American creed because his interests do not represent all of America. This further distraction and further movement to this patriotic debate works to silence any social change of the system and says that this is not the priority of the majority of America. The priority instead should be how do we respect the flag and how do we respect our country. This ideology of white supremacy is important and essential to examine so the system is not taken for granted in our country. That is a very scary precedent to uphold, and it's something that needs to be challenged and needs to be questioned and needs to be examined so that we can reimagine alternative possibilities and a United States in which patriotism is not seen to be incompatible with protesting or incompatible with the idea of racial injustice and striving for racial justice. These can all exist once a system that benefits those people who do not want such resources to be allocated to people who are not white is challenged and pushed back against.